My name's Drew Robbins, and I'm a technical evangelist with Microsoft, focusing on IIS. And today we're going to talk about partying with PHP on Microsoft IIS 7. How many of you are PHP developers? I assume that if you're in this session, most of you are. There's a few that didn't raise their hand. Good. And how many of you today are deploying on Windows? That's exactly what I expected. So today we're going to talk about probably why you're not deploying on Windows today, but why you will want to take another look and look at deploying your PHP applications on Windows tomorrow. So we're going to go through really 3 different levels. First, we're just going to talk about how easy it is to configure PHP on IIS 7 and why it's better than in the past. Okay? Then we're going to talk about how you can make your application rock on IIS 7. And what I mean by that is just when you take your application, certainly you could deploy it to Windows, and it's going to execute, and we're going to get the performance we expect out of any great hosting platform. But how can we make your application better? But at this stage, what we're going to do is we're not going to touch any of your application code. We're going to talk about ways you can make your PHP application better without actually having to change the code. Okay? And then at the third level, we're going to talk about taking full advantage of the Windows platform. So things you can do in your PHP code to take advantage of those features that you have available to you now that you're hosting on IIS. We're going to do the Q&A in the open space area that's in the sandbox. So join me down there after the session, and we can dive deeper into any areas that you like. Obviously, we cannot cover everything in one session, so that will be a great place. We could spend multiple times through the rest of the week diving into the specific areas that you need for your PHP applications and talk about how you would address those issues on Windows. So let's talk about a little bit of history here. And one of the interesting things that we know about the PHP community is that there's a vast majority of PHP developers are developing their applications on Windows, but then they're deploying their applications to Linux. And there's a good reason for that. The reason is because you have a trade-off in Windows. You either get performance or you get reliability with your PHP application on Windows. And there's some historical reasons for that. PHP was originally written as a CGI application. Okay? So when you run it on Linux, you're typically running it in a CGI installation as well, which works great on Linux. With a CGI application, every time a request comes into the server, a new process gets started, a new PHP process. That PHP process accesses your code and obviously generates some HTML and sends it back to the browser, and then that PHP process goes away. Starting a PHP process on Linux is a very lightweight thing to do. So CGI application on Linux works fairly well. On Windows, however, starting a new process is a very heavyweight thing to do. It just has to do with the differences in the OS and a trade-off that Windows made between thread management and process management. Linux is actually the opposite of Windows, where it's lightweight to start a process, but it's heavyweight to manage threads. Windows, it's heavyweight to start a process, but then lightweight to start new threads. So with CGI on Windows, we had a nice stable installation of PHP where the performance just wasn't there. So the PHP community came along and wrote an ISAPI extension that extended IIS and hosted the PHP core inside the IIS process. So what this did was take away that expensive operation of starting that process for each request. The problem, though, with this is that because of the history of PHP, the way it was written, there's still a lot of PHP code out there, especially in some of the modules that you depend on, that were not written to be thread safe. They didn't need to be because they were running under this CGI environment. So when you take those PHP modules and you run them into IIS, which is a multi-threaded environment, you get instability. So we had a choice here. We had either we could run it as CGI and get great reliability and poor performance, or we could run PHP under ISAPI on Windows and get great performance, but then we just had to reboot our server 3 or 4 times a day. How many people want to do that? No one? No one wants to reboot their server 3 or 4 times a day? So recently, Microsoft, in the past year and a half, started a collaboration, a strategic collaboration with Zend in order to improve performance of PHP on Windows. And there was a couple things that were a part of that. One was that Zen was going to do a bunch of work to work on the PHP core to make it work great on Windows. On the Microsoft side, we committed to creating what's called a fast CGI module. You might also use fast CGI on Linux as well, so you may be familiar with this type of configuration. Basically what it does for us is allows us to reuse the PHP process that we were using in our CGI configuration. So basically that first request comes in, we start a PHP process, we use this open protocol called fast CGI to negotiate with the PHP process multiple connections. So each connection doesn't have to start that new PHP process. We can reuse it. So the nice thing is we get that stable single-threaded environment for PHP that it needs, but we also get great performance because we're not taking that hit on every request, starting and stopping that process. So this really is the recommended way for you to begin configuring your PHP applications on Windows moving forward. Fast CGI is not, however, an iOS 7 feature. It is available for iOS 6 as a download. It has the same functionality as iOS 7. It works in a very much a similar way. There are walkthroughs on iOS.net. We're doing a lot of work to make sure that the popular PHP applications that are out there are working on Windows, and we've documented the configuration steps for probably a dozen of them, and those are out on www.iis.net. If you go to www.iis.net/php, you'll find the list of applications as well as other kind of configuration documentation for PHP on Windows. And then just at the bottom here, this is a result of that close collaboration with Zen Technologies. So you'll also see that Zen is making improvements in their recent builds to improve the performance of PHP on Windows, just doing some platform-specific things to make sure the Zen core engine is really doing its job. They are creating a certified version of the Zen core for Windows so that you can know that you've got support from Zen for PHP running on Windows. So Fast CGI is available on iOS 6 and iOS 7. There's really no differences in the functionality, but there are just a few differences in how you're going to get the module and configure it. In Fast CGI in iOS 6, it is a download. You have to go out to ios.net and download the Fast CGI module and install it on Windows Server 2003. On iOS 7, it actually is a part of Windows Server 2008. So it's part of the install. You go in and you make sure that you check off the CGI functionality in the web server role in Windows Server, and that Fast CGI module will then be installed. With Vista, it comes with Service Pack 1. So when you install Service Pack 1 and enable the CGI functionality in Windows Vista in the Add Remove Windows Features control panel, you will also get the Fast CGI functionality. Now, a lot of people have not yet gotten access to Service Pack 1, so there's also a download for Fast CGI for Vista without Service Pack 1 if you'd like to start using it before you get Service Pack 1 installed. In Fast CGI iOS 6, we implement Fast CGI as an ISAPI extension. In iOS 7, it is a native iOS 7 module. There's some new ISAPI, basically some new APIs that replace ISAPI in iOS 7 that the Fast CGI module takes advantage of, and there's some advantages for that module to do that. There's great help documentation. There's two differences in configuration for the two different products. We won't worry about that right now. But the important thing here at the bottom is that both of these are fully supported by Microsoft. So when you run these in your environment, if you run into an issue with Fast CGI, you will get support from Microsoft on these. And then finally at the bottom, I'm just noting that we wrote Fast CGI really with PHP developers in mind, but this is an open protocol and it works with any application platform that implements Fast CGI. So let's just go and take a look at how easy it is to configure PHP and get some applications up and running. So I'm going to switch over here, and we're just going to first take a look at our configuration. And I mentioned that you have to have the CGI feature enabled in Windows in order to have fast CGI available. And so let me just quickly show you where that is. If you click on Programs and Control Panels, and then click Turn Windows Features On or Off, you'll be asked to elevate here because it's an administrative process here. And it'll load the list of Windows features, and one of those features is Internet Information Services. So of course you want to make sure IIS is checked, but you also want to make sure that you drill down under World Wide Web Services, under Application Development Features, and choose the CGI feature. And Fast CGI is included in that CGI feature. So when you check that, that'll put the Fast CGI module and the functionality that you need on your Windows box. This is very similar in Windows Server 2008. However, you'll use a server manager and go under the web server role and drill down into these same features and find CGI. Okay? So make sure that's installed. Otherwise, you will not get off to a good start with PHP on Windows. Now, the next thing is we need to make sure that we've got PHP installed, obviously. And there's really no differences here. I just downloaded the PHP code and I placed it in the PHP directory in my root drive. You can put it in program files if you want. Some people put it under inetpub. It's really up to you. The important thing is to make sure that that directory has read permissions for the network service process. So if you make sure users or the network service process has read permission for that directory, then you'll be fine. In the root directory, you'll be fine. If you put it under program files or inetpub, you may need to modify those permissions. Okay? So we have PHP installed. One other note here is do make sure that you're using one of the later builds of PHP. Like I said, Zend is doing some work here to make sure that PHP is working great on Windows. So you want to make sure that you have their latest enhancements. And then also, the Fast CGI module, because we're running in a single-threaded environment, it supports the non-thread safe version of PHP. And that means you're going to get a little bit of more performance out of PHP by running in that non-thread safe mode. Okay? So go ahead and download the non-thread safe version of PHP. Put it in your PHP directory. And then what we need is some PHP code. So let's go under inetpub www-root. If you're not familiar with this directory, this is just the root of our web content on Windows. So right here I've got an index. Let's just open that up in Expression Web. And I've got the famous Hello World for PHP, which is the PHP info function. So let's try to make a request to that now. Go to localhost and index.php and let's see what happens. And I'll take a second just for Internet Explorer to rev up here. So what we get here is a 404.3 not found. And the reason is because we haven't actually configured PHP yet. So we've got PHP installed, but we haven't configured IIS to say, hey, take the .php extension and forward that to the PHP CGI process for processing. So what IIS does is by default it's just going to return and say, you know what, I don't understand this extension. I don't have a content type defined for it. So just respond with a 404 and tell the user, whatever you're trying to access is not on this server. All right. So we need to go and configure IIS now. The easiest way to do this, both on Windows Vista and on Windows Server, is to bring up IIS Manager and use the new IIS Manager to configure it. We're going to talk more about IIS Manager in a few minutes, but right now we're going to use it just to configure PHP. And the easiest way to launch it is to go to the Start area in Windows Vista or Windows Server 2008 and type IIS. And the first thing that's going to come up in the list is the Server Manager. Execute that. It's going to ask us to elevate again, because again we need to run as admin in order to make these changes. And you're presented here with the new IIS Manager. There's a couple things that I just want to point out to you in the new IIS Manager, and then we'll talk a little bit more about it in a few minutes. First, notice that I have this connections area. I have the ability here to connect to a server, connect to a site, and connect to an application. IIS Manager gives you the ability to use the tool, the UI, from remote to configure a server across either your network or across the web. Okay? In the past, it was very difficult to do this with the Windows IIS Manager, and the reason was because it used RPC and you had to open up weird ports on your firewall, random ports, and it just wasn't a great experience. The new IIS Manager uses the HTTP protocol to access a service on the server that then allows you to make these changes locally but have them impact the server remotely. So it makes it a lot easier to configure. It's just one port, a known port that you need to configure in order to make that work. So we can connect up to any server here. Right now we're just going to be configuring the local server which is already in our list. And so this is familiar if you've used IIS Manager in the past. We have a tree view on the left. The differences here are that we no longer have these huge dialogues that pop up that have a multitude of tabs in them, and things are kind of thrown in wherever the product team was adding the feature at the time. They've really reworked this and rethought how to lay out IIS Manager. So in the middle, we have the different tasks that have to do with whatever we have highlighted in the tree view. And then on the right, we have this area called Actions that allows us to do things like restart websites, restart application pools, configure advanced settings, things like that. What we want to do right now is configure the handler for PHP. And so in the center area, we see that we've got the IIS features in the middle, and one of those features is handler mappings. And this is where we're going to configure all of the extensions and tie them to some application platform tool, some handler code that's going to process that particular request and return some HTML. All right, so as we scroll down here, we see things like ASP.NET, we see the static file handler. We don't have PHP in here. So what we're going to do is add a module mapping, and we're going to do that for the PHP extension. Of course, if you have other extensions you want to answer to as well, you can do that. We're going to then scroll down and find the fast CGI module. Again, you'll find the CGI module in here, but you want to make sure that you're using the fast CGI module moving forward, so you get that combination of stability and performance. So we click there. We'll go find our PHP CGI process in the PHP directory, and then we'll call this PHP. This name is just anything you want to call it. You could call it PHP module, whatever. It's just an identifier for the list so you can find it easily. I usually just call it PHP. I click OK. It says, do you want to configure the fast CGI module to recognize the PHP CGI process? We'll click yes. And it went and configured that for us. It's that easy. So now we'll go back to our browser. We'll click refresh. And it'll make that request to the server again and now forward it to the fast CGI process. So one of the things is that's making that request. I think Internet Explorer is just taking a while there. So here's our response, the PHP info. You can see we're now running under the fast CGI server API, which is exactly what we want. We could scroll down and, of course, see what's configured. And you can see all of the real popular PHP modules that you would want configured for your application environment are available here in Windows. So one of the things you might have noticed, though, as I was configuring the handlers and the modules, is that there's a lot of stuff configured on this server. And if I'm a PHP developer and I'm just wanting to serve up PHP pages, I don't need a lot of these things to be in here, right? And so I'd rather, as a PHP developer or admin, say, let's just install the minimal things that I need in IIS in order to run my application environment. There's a couple reasons I'd want to do that, right? One is performance, right? Having less things installed in IIS will give me a smaller memory footprint and less things processing or less things looking at every single request that's coming through the server. The other reason that I would want to minimize this is for security. The less things that are executing on the server means less attack surface for any kind of hackers that are going to come at my website. I'm giving them less opportunities by reducing the functionality. So let's go down just to the command prompt here, and let's reconfigure the server. But I'm going to do it in a different way. I'm going to show off to you the new configuration system that we'll talk a little bit more about. The new configuration system is now external to a binary database. In the past, it was a binary database. It was locked up. It was hard to look at. It's now in a set of XML files completely available to you to look at and to change using any editor that you like. But another advantage that it gives you is that you can have best practice configuration files that you can X-copy or just copy, file copy from server to server, or from a backup directory into your configuration directory. So what I have here is the directory listing that has the 3 XML configuration files, kind of the main files for the server. The one that we care about right now is application host.config, which it's really the database for the configuration. This is the master configuration. This is where IIS Manager and IIS itself looks at to understand how it's configured. And so I'm going to reconfigure the server just by copying in from another location here a config that I called minimum config. And we're just going to overwrite application host.config. And just like that, I've reconfigured the server. I'm going to go back into IIS Manager, and I'm going to refresh and show you what I did. I just removed all of those handlers that were in that list. Things like the ASP.NET handlers, the different service handlers, all kinds of different things that we've added to IIS in order to make application development great on Windows. But in this case, the only thing that I want to serve up from my server is PHP and static files. And so that's the only things that I'm going to configure here. So I'm also going to go back out to my server, and there's another list here called modules that I also have a list of modules. These are the things that are going to execute on every request before the PHP process handles the request. Things like authentication, things like the fast CGI module and static file module. These are all things that are going to execute as part of the request. I only have 3 things loaded right now. And an interesting thing that I can do is, I think I can still do this. Let's just look at the IIS process and look at the number of modules that are loaded. And I actually skipped something that I wanted to do. And so let me just reverse the configuration back to what it was. Make this request one more time. And then let's look at the module count. You're going to see the module count right now is 83. So there's 83 modules that are currently loaded in IIS. And if you get a list of those modules, this just shows all of the assemblies that are loaded as part of the IIS process. There's a ton of stuff in here that we don't need. And in fact, if we look at the memory footprint, look at private memory size, looks about 21 megs, the memory footprint. We haven't really done a whole lot, so that will actually grow as we start loading applications. But we've got 21 megs. So now let's go back and put our minimum configuration in. Okay. And we'll rerun our request. And look at our module count again. And we're down to 61. So we've just eliminated about 20 modules that we didn't need for our particular scenario. And if we look at the private memory size again, you'll see we're down to 3 megs. So we went from 21 megs of a memory footprint down to actually about 3.5, almost 4 megs. So we've reduced the memory footprint, we've reduced the attack surface, we only have the functionality that we need. So I think this is great for PHP developers to have the control they need over the server. Now, what we've done so far is just configure an index.php that has a PHP info. That's not very interesting. So let me just show you that popular applications also work. If we add an application, we'll call this WordPress. I've already got this installed in a directory. Click OK. Should be able to see the WordPress files here, and we do. And if we right-click and click Browse, we'll find that WordPress also is working on IIS7. So many of the popular PHP applications, those communities have gone through the work to make sure their applications are working great on Windows as well. And like I said, if you have an application that you want to get working on Windows, iis.net/php is the place to go to get directions for those popular PHP apps. All right, so now we know that you can configure PHP on Windows, and you can get your popular PHP applications. But now, how can we make your PHP applications better on Windows? And again, at this stage, we're not going to talk yet about the code changes that you're going to make your applications better. We're going to talk about the things that you can do without changing your code. So there's a bunch of things here. One is there's this new modular architecture for a reduced attack surface. We saw that in our demo, where we reduced the modules and the handlers down to the minimal modules we need. One of the interesting things you can play around with as well, get IIS installed and remove all the modules and all the handlers and see what happens. I like to call it the null server because IIS will do nothing. It has no functionality installed. But that just proves the modularity and the control that you have over the code that's running on IIS. Another area that you can take advantage of is the new XML-based configuration system. We'll talk about that in just a few slides here. The remote management capability, I showed you how you can connect to servers. Not only can this help you with managing PHP on IIS and the IIS server itself, but you can also build into that IIS manager and make your own application remote management capable. And we'll look at that in the next demo. There is advanced diagnostics on IIS. There's some great ways for you to figure out what's going wrong with the server if something's not working correctly. There's this great thing called failed request tracing that captures all of the events that occur within the pipeline and how long every module takes to execute and any error messages that get outputted into that buffer. If that request does not respond with a 200 status code, or if the request takes longer than what you think it should, you can configure the criteria for this, but if it meets that criteria, it'll take that buffer and dump it down the disk. Later on, you can come back and you don't have to worry about reproducing the error that occurred. You can just take a look at that buffer and say, oh, this module that we just configured that's running in the pipeline is taking, 3 seconds, and we thought it was only going to take, half a second. So you get the diagnostics you need, and you can figure out what's going on with your app. There's also great integration with Windows Media Services and Media Pack. We saw some of those features in the keynote this week, and there's some other sessions going on around streaming and the capabilities of the Windows platform for streaming. These are great technologies because you get them for free on Windows. You don't have to buy an extra product to do media delivery on your Windows platform. And we're going to look at that in the third demo. And then finally, there's the ability to extend IIS using managed code. And the advantage here is in the past, if you wanted to do something to IIS besides just host an application, if you wanted to add a new module to the pipeline, or you wanted to create a new handler, or you wanted to extend the UI, you had to pull out C, C++, and work with some pretty complicated APIs in order to build those modules. And the impact that you can make to the server was pretty significant. You could, release a new module, it ends up doing something you didn't expect it to do, and it could bring down your server. Well, with IIS, we've opened up the extensibility to managed code, to .NET code. So you can use C# or VB, or really any .NET language to extend IIS. There's a couple things that are great about that for PHP developers. One, if you want to extend IIS, C# is a lot easier to learn for a PHP developer than C or C++. So that's great for you. But the second area, too, is it reduces the number of mistakes you can make when you're building that code because you're in that managed, protected environment. The third advantage to this that I thought was important to you guys as PHP developers is that the great thing about PHP is the number of applications and components out there that are freely available. And really, as a PHP developer, when we want to get a job done, we just want to get it done. We don't necessarily want to code for the sake of coding. So we want to have all those components available. Well, there's a ton of components available in the .NET world as well. And now with this ability to extend IIS with managed code, you have a whole other set of components that you can draw on to integrate with your application. We'll take a look at that in a few minutes as well. So let's look at this modular architecture really quick and understand the changes here. First of all, what I have on the slide is the pipeline. This is the incoming request. On the left side, we have the handlers area. This is the whatever code is actually going to handle the request. And then on the bottom, we have the outgoing pipeline. And as I said before, this is the minimum configuration for IIS. You can actually rip out all of the modules and all the handlers. IIS won't do very much, but you can run with this configuration. And then you can think about it from a bottom-up approach. You can say, here are the components that I want to add into IIS for my scenario. So in this case, I've added anonymous authentication. I've added caching. IIS has a great new kernel mode cache that really improves the performance of both static and dynamic requests. And then I added the ASP.NET handler, and I added the static file handler so I could get images and other static files. On the outbound, we enable compression, and we enable error handling, the error handling module in IIS. So this is great, but maybe later on I want to come along and enable a different authentication. So I could remove the anonymous authentication module and add the URL authorization and forms authentication module. Forms authentication is a forms-based technology that was introduced with ASP.NET that can now be used with any content in IIS. Later on, maybe I am not using ASP.NET, so I want to configure it for using FastCGI instead of ASP.NET. Now, one of the interesting things about this is with this new modular architecture and this new thing we call the integrated pipeline, it allows you to use these managed modules along with what we call unmanaged code, okay? All of the things that are not written in .NET. So you can use features of the Windows platform such as forms authentication, which gives you an out-of-the-box authentication capability that's built into web pages, an out-of-the-box membership API that's pluggable. So you can use the default SQL Server provider, you can use an Active Directory provider, you can use a custom provider that goes against your existing username database. That's all pluggable. But you can use that managed functionality along with your native modules, including FastCGI and PHP. It's pretty powerful. The other thing that means is that it's easy to add new modules into this managed pipeline using whatever managed language that you want to use. So there's a lot of great new opportunities here. The next area with IIS that we need to understand to know how our applications are going to get a lot better and easier to manage is the new configuration system. As I said before, and we looked at those files, the new configuration system is now in an XML-based schema. It is a distributed configuration, which means that we've got that central application host.config file, but we also have additional files at the website and application level that can override settings or set local settings. One of the great things about this XML configuration system is those files can be copied using either the command prompt or they can be copied using the Windows Explorer, however you want to copy those around. The local settings with the web.config, those are going to be stored along with your application in the file system, which means when you go to deploy your PHP application, you're copying the configuration for that application up to the server as well. Makes it a lot easier to deploy your application. And this is all enabled because of this new file-based XML configuration system. Now, one of the issues with a file-based XML configuration system, and to be honest, I run into this all the time with PHP, where I go into the PHP ini file and I end up putting an extra period in somewhere or just type something incorrectly, and I don't know until I save that PHP file and make a request and the server blows up. With the configuration system here, it's all schema-based. And what that means is IIS will validate it for us and tell us exactly where we've made a mistake in the configuration. The schema, both understands the structure of the configuration document and also all of the valid values, even down to things like numbers that have a certain range that they should be in, or string values that need to be in a certain format. There's all kinds of things that the schema will validate in those configuration files for you. The new IIS Manager, we took a quick look at this. Again, we are now have a rewritten IIS Manager that makes it a lot easier for you to configure the server. This is one of those things, if you did use IIS Manager in Windows Server 2003 or older versions of Windows, this will take a little while to get used to. But what you'll find is that once you get used to this, it's a lot easier to locate the things that you need to get at in order to configure your server. On the right side, we've got the actions that allow us to do things like restart and stop, set advanced settings. In the middle, we've got the areas or features that are required to configure on the server. And then on that left side, we have that navigation capability. And again, just to reiterate, this is completely, all these modules you can use from remote to configure a server across the web or across your network. Makes administration a lot easier. So let's take a look at how we can take advantage of some of these features to make a PHP application better without actually changing the code. What I did here for this example is I took the QDig application. How many people are familiar with QDig? Anyone? It's a somewhat popular image gallery on the web. It's written as a single PHP file. And the reason they did that was that you could take that file and dump it into any directory with images, and it would instantly kind of give you an image gallery on the web. It makes it very easy to kind of get running. The configuration for the PHP file, for simplicity's sake, is written into the PHP file itself. So all of the settings are like the first 100 lines of the code, and they just set variables that change the way that the image gallery works. So I thought this is a simple application we don't need to understand the architecture of, that I would get working on PHP and then enhance it without actually changing any of the code for the QDig application. Just to show that you can take advantage of some of these features and not have to do a lot of work to your own application code. So let's see how I made this application work great on Windows. I'm going to go back into IIS Manager, and what I'm going to do is mount this directory as an application. This directory, all I have in it right now is images. And what I'm going to do is just add that as an application. And we'll just call it QDig. And that's going to go to inetpub QDig is that directory. We'll click OK. And we see in the content view for that app that we just got a bunch of images. So if I made a request to this, it would, I could request all these images individually, or I could try to get the default directory listing, which is not enabled right now, and it would just respond with a no response. So as a user of this particular IIS server, I want to get QDig installed on there. And so what I did, just to show off kind of the things you can do with IIS Manager, is I added a new module into IIS Manager. This took me maybe a couple hours in an afternoon really to do. Once you have the pattern down for how to do this, it's really simple to use the Windows Forms technology in .NET in order to add these interfaces in the IIS Manager. And when I created it, it instantly started working for remote. So I could connect to a server from remote at this point that had this QDig module and use this module just like I'm using it now. So what I'm going to do is double click on that. You'll see the interface is grayed out because the first thing I did in the module is I said, is this QDig script installed in this local directory? If it's not, I display a message, say the QDig script is not present, and I provide an option for adding QDig. So with one click now, I'm going to install that QDig script in the directory, and it's going to enable that interface. If I go back to the content view and I refresh this, you'll see there's now an index.php. Like I said, this was a single file script. There's only one file to it. If I right-click and do a browse here, it'll bring up the QDig image gallery, which automatically generates thumbnails for me and gives me a nice interface that I can now include this in other PHP applications or just have it standalone here. And so I can click through these images, and I can now pass this URL out to my family members who I want to view this image gallery. So the other things that I did in this QDig feature is I provided some options for changing some of those settings in the QDig file. So on the server side, what it does is it really just looks at the index.php script, finds the variable where the variable gets set for that particular setting, and just replaces the value. In the UI, what I did is I just used Windows Forms to provide some UI, some rich UI for changing those settings. For example, there's a setting in the QDig script called background color. So if I wanted to change the background color, we can make it something really pretty like green. Click Apply. We'll go back here, we refresh, and of course now it's green. So I went through and exposed some of the interesting properties that I thought would just show off the types of things you can do, but there's literally like 100 settings in QDig that I could expose to this user interface. So there's a couple of things that you might take away as actions for this. One is if you are a community application developer, so you're providing applications out there, or you're a software vendor that's providing PHP applications out, this gives you an opportunity to really light up your application on Windows, to provide a way for customers and for hosters to make it that much easier to install and configure your PHP application. If you write PHP applications for the enterprise, you have to think about the day that you release that PHP application out to the enterprise, and an admin in your IT department is now going to start taking care of it. Why not provide them a rich interface for them to manage your application and make it a little bit easier for them to resolve issues or to reconfigure it instead of calling you up at 2 in the morning and pulling you into the office to do that. So those are a couple of ways that you can think about how you might leverage this functionality. So we have image gallery. I'm going to actually set the background back to white so we don't all get annoyed here. Oh, by the way, I did also do an update, so if there's additions to the QDig script or changes in the QDig script, I can also click Update. It'll copy a new version of index.php into that directory and reset the settings here. So we'll go back and refresh. We'll see we're back to a normal background. Now, I'm thinking about pushing this image gallery out to the web, and of course I want my family members to see this, but I may not want everybody to see this image gallery. And so I want to provide some quick membership. But this is just my personal image gallery, so I don't want to spend the next 3 weeks writing authentication routines and a membership database and everything else in order to make this application authenticated. So with IIS, we have now the ability to leverage this thing called ASP.NET Membership. What this was a feature that was added on to ASP.NET that allowed you to quickly add a membership database to your application. And it managed things like authorization, authentication. It manages the process of registering for your site. It manages the process of doing password recovery. All of the things that you have to think about whenever you're doing authentication for a site. Now, if you've written these things before, you know they're almost always the same thing, but they're always kind of thought about after the application is already written in an org. Now we're nearing the end. We got to think about how we're going to secure this app. And it's always the same kind of back and forth conversation of, well, how strong do you want the passwords to be? What do you want to have happen if a user needs a password reset? All these questions need to be answered. This functionality is now all built into ASP.NET. The problem was, in the past though, is that it was only for ASP.NET. So if you had static files, images, like this image gallery, even though you had secured your ASP.NET application with membership, your images were still available to anybody that knew the URL to that image. Or if you had a PHP application, this ASP.NET membership functionality did you really no good. So let's see how easy it is to really configure ASP.NET membership. What I'm going to do is a couple of things here. One is I have a configuration file that already has the settings that we want. And again, this goes back to we have this ability to copy and paste that configuration or deploy that configuration along with our applications. So here I've got a web.config file. Let's just give that a quick look and we'll see it's just got a few settings. One of the settings down here is the modules list. What we need to do is, these modules were originally written as managed code for .NET applications. We just need to tell IIS we want to use those managed modules for all requests. So that's all I'm doing down here is re-adding the modules and telling it I'm removing this thing called a precondition, which caused it only to execute for ASP.NET apps. I'm adding a default document. Here's the classic thing that you always had to go into the UI to do in IIS. It was very difficult to do this in any other way. Now with this new XML-based system, I can define the default document right along with my application and just copy it into that folder to make it work. The settings for membership are right here. I'm going to set the authentication mode to forms, and then I'm going to turn on the role manager because I'm going to do some role-based authorization as well. So I'm just going to take that configuration file, copy it into my QDig application. We'll just copy and paste that, replace what's there. Copy and replace. And now we've configured authorization. If I go into the UI, we'll see that the same settings are picked up there. If I look at my authentication settings, you'll see that forms authentication is enabled just by copying that configuration file in here. Again, the nice thing, I can take this directory now, it's pre-configured, push it up to a server, and my application will automatically be configured when I deploy it. Okay, the next thing that I'm going to move into this directory is I need some kind of login page. And I want to show you the code that's required for this login page. It's just a little bit of ASP.NET code. It is still managed in the ASP.NET system. And I have a header, and I have a control called login. This is really as simple as it gets for doing membership and login in a web-based form. So we're going to copy that. And then last thing, I'm going to copy to directory or this login, and then I just have a little bit of code we're going to come back to in a minute that I'll copy in now. We'll paste that in here. And now we have everything we need. We have the configuration file. We have a login page for ASP.NET to prompt the user for username and password. And we have this code that we're going to use in just a minute. So one of the things that we can do now is go into .NET users. The nice thing about this membership system is that IIS Manager plugs into it, so it provides me with an interface for managing my users and the roles that they belong to. The backend that I'm using right now is SQL Server, so I'm just using a SQL Server database on the local machine. And that is an option. So you can actually replace that with whatever provider you want to use. If you have an Active Directory installation, you can use that. If you have a membership database for your application that's already created, you can create a provider for that as well. There's actually some examples out on MSDN and out on IIS.net on how we've built modules for WordPress to go against the WordPress database. We've built modules to go against MySQL-based databases and do the same type of thing that you get with SQL Server. The nice thing about this provider, this SQL Server provider, is if I don't have the database created yet, it'll actually generate it for me on the fly. And it just really makes it easy to start securing your application with membership. Let's see what I got here. So I thought I already had a user created, but apparently I don't. So let's add a user. We'll call it Drew. Drew@drewby.com. Give myself a password. I probably say favorite color is blue. That's actually my daughter's favorite color. She's just switched from pink to blue this week. If I click next, okay, it did take my password. Let's just try something here. Let's just use password and see what happens. One of the nice things about this provider system is it does a lot of the kind of logic for you. It's not doing it in this case. In order to say you don't have a strong password, you need to have a stronger password. And you can set up some of those rules like password length and complexity and those type of things. We're going to click Next, click Finish. Oh, now it's telling me the specified password is invalid. So we'll go back and retype that. And now we have a user. So just like that, we now have a user in our system. We can also set up some roles. If we go back to the roles area and click Add, we'll just say, we'll call this QDig admin, because we're going to use that in a few minutes. And we'll just leave that unassigned right now. But now we even have some roles now that we can check against. Okay. Now we're going to go back to QDig. And what we need to do is we have authentication set up, but we haven't really denied users from accessing any content. So we still have anonymous authentication really enabled here. So let's go and add a new role. We'll add a deny role, and we'll say we're going to deny all anonymous users. We're going to click OK. We're going to go back to our page, and we're going to refresh this. And what it's going to do is it's going to say, hey, you're not authenticated, and you need to be authenticated to access this resource. So even though we're trying to access a PHP resource or an image resource, it's going to prompt us to get authenticated here. So now we're going to type in Drew, and we'll make sure we got the right password. Click Log In. It'll access that database and then allow me to get to the application now. So this is great. So now I've protected kind of with some basic rules, I've protected my application from just anybody on the web getting to these images. And I can now start assigning username and passwords out to my family members or my friends so they can view my image gallery. But one of the things that I also want to be able to do is QDig provides this admin capability that I already have configured. What I wanted to do was say, you know what, by default, QDig allows anybody that has access to the application in order to, it allows anybody really to set these captions. And so what I wanted to do was say, I only want people that I designate, so I want to have this list of 10 people that have access to my image gallery. I only want maybe 2 or 3 of them to be able to add captions to these images. And so one of the things I needed to do was make QDig smart enough to say whether a user that I authenticated against was authorized to access these captions. Well, one of the issues here still is that PHP and the authentication is running in really 2 different processes. And it's very hard to get those 2 things to communicate. So one of the things I can do is I can look at the username in the environment variables. I can see the username in the environment variables that was authenticated using that forms authentication. But I can't really get access to roles. So I can't really differentiate in my code between Drew or mom or wife or whatever that happens to be. So I need a way to assign roles to those people and then differentiate between those. So let's take a look at how I did that. What I did is I used this new ability really to extend IIS7, and I created a quick module. Remember the modules in that pipeline slide were the things that I plugged in that will really impact every request, will execute with every request before the handler gets it. I have the ability now with just managed code to build modules into that pipeline. So if you wanted to do things like do a little URL rewriting or set up some environment variables for each request or plug into authentication like I'm doing here, you can do that. So I created, you can see the entire module really, the main method is just a few lines of code here. And all I'm really doing is looking at a request parameter that QDig sets that says that they want to get to the admin interface. So QDig sets this request parameter, and then it knows on that next request to show the caption interface and allow that the editing capability. So if they are trying to get to admin, then I'm just going to use the ASP.NET role API to check to see if the current user is in my admin role. And that admin role I just configure in a configuration file external to this code. Okay? If they're not in that admin role, then I go ahead and I deny the request. I set the status code to 401, and I call complete request so that it stops executing at that point. So by doing that now, if I click on admin, I get prompted for a new login. Okay? It says, you know what, you don't have access to get to that admin functionality. You need to re-authenticate here. So what we need to do is make sure that Drew, the account Drew, has access to admin. And what I'm doing here, I'll just explain the magic that's going on here. Right now I'm using SQL Server Express, and I'm using the ability to attach to a file. And when my web process attaches to that file, I can't get IIS Manager locally to attach to the same file until that process goes away. Typically what I do in a production environment is I use a non-attached file. So I use a regular kind of database connection to SQL Server that already has a mounted file, and then you don't run into that particular issue. But in this case, I just happen to have a file lock there. So let's look at the user Drew, and you'll see my roles there in the dialog. It says QDig admin. I'll check that. I'll click OK. Let's go back out and close this app and reopen it, just so that cookie, the authentication cookie, goes away. Go to qdig.index.php. And it'll ask us to re-log in. And of course, now I'm part of QDig admin, so I'll have that caption editing capability. So again, what you're seeing here now is we've opened up the world for you to have just that many more components that you can draw from. Both the ASP.NET functionality that we include with the product, but also all of the .NET modules out there that people have written and made available to the community are now accessible to you as well as a PHP developer. So you can really use the best of both worlds. Let's go ahead and log in. And now I'm getting the opposite problem. Apologize for that. Cool. Let's do this. So we get logged in here. Again, I was just having an issue with the file locking. I should be using that mounted database instead of a shared file database. So now I have access to my my application. I can click admin, and of course it's not getting the role still. We know that we added it, right? So I'll make this this code available as well from my blog. My blog is blogs.iis.net/drobbins, and so you'll be able to download it and take a look at how I did this. And let's just make sure I actually added. That's going to do the same thing, isn't it? All right. So I'll make that code available as well as we've got some webcasts out there as well that show the same exact thing working. Also, Mike Wolodarski has written an article for MSDN that goes even further than what I did with the QDig application. It does all kinds of things with URL rewriting and other extensions that he's done to IIS. This is out on msdn.microsoft.com. If you search for QDig or search for PHP, you'll find those examples. They're great examples to take a look at. Let's move on for now, and I'll come back to that later. And we'll talk a little bit more about what other things you can do with Windows when you're on our platform. So now, so far, what we've done is we've configured a PHP application on Windows. We've made it better without impacting the code. But now, what things can you do on Windows that you can take advantage of now and really form your application around some of those features? So there's a ton of things, really. One is you can obviously leverage that rich functionality of iOS 7. You can even go beyond what I did by integrating some of making some changes to your code to sense some of the environment variables that we can set, all of those things in order to take advantage of those managed modules, as well as all the add-on modules that are on iOS.net. Another thing that we've done to make PHP on Windows better is we've created a new SQL Server 2005 driver for PHP. This is a native driver that plugs into PHP that we'll talk about more in just a second. And then another area that you can take advantage of in Windows are all of the other services that we provide as products that run on top of Windows. Things like Active Directory for managing your authentication, your enterprise class authentication scenarios. Exchange for doing email. You can integrate with Exchange and use its APIs in order to provide management and also interfaces into the mail accounts. SharePoint is a content management and portal system that we have for enterprises that you can also integrate with from PHP. And then also, you can always leverage the functionality of Office applications in your PHP code using COM interfaces as well. So some great things that you can do there. The add-on modules of IIS, when you open up that IIS Manager and you see those modules, those feature areas that we saw in the center of the screen, those are not all of the modules that we've created for IIS. The IIS team is releasing several modules out to IIS.net that you can download and add onto your server. Some of the more interesting ones include things like WebDAV. WebDAV is a publishing protocol for doing content management on the server. We have a new WebDAV module that plugs into IIS 7. FTP7 is a new FTP server for IIS. And then we also have a version of front page server extensions for IIS 7 that you can download and install. All of those around making publishing easier. Media Pack is another set of modules that we've provided on IIS.net. You saw those in the keynote demo the other day, the bitrate throttling and the playlist functionality. And there's other modules to come. You can keep on watching IIS.net, and there'll be more and more modules that are pushed out there. This SQL Server driver is really a great project that the SQL Server team is executing on to create a native module for PHP that fully takes advantage of the SQL platform, enables really some great scenarios around using SQL Server as both in the SQL Server Express version for your kind of single site and simple scenarios, all the way up to the enterprise kind of data center version that's going to scale out for you. So you can really grow your application up and know that you're going to have a consistent database platform to work with. It uses the base PHP drivers API, and it really tries to replicate the existing database drivers that are out there so that you feel like you're using a PHP module. And you should be able to get up and working very easily on that. So let's take a look at one last example that I've built in some PHP code in order to take advantage of some of those features. So I'm going to switch over to IIS Manager and add one more application. And what we're going to do is call this a video player. Now you saw in the keynote demo the playlists and bitrate throttling modules. What I've done here in this video player is said, you know what, I want to put some videos out on the web, kind of in the same simplicity as the QDig image gallery, but I also want to monetize that now. I want to actually start making money off my family members, right? No, I want to put these videos out there and show some advertisement and start charging advertisers for those advertisements. And so this playlist functionality, what it allows you to do is to create what they call playlist files on the server. And the way they allow you to do that is you can add a new playlist. You can call this, we'll just call it test. Give it a description test. We can add some content. We have some content out here. We'll just say a physical path. And got some files. We'll just take this industrial video. We'll click OK. And what that's going to do when we click Apply is it's going to add a new file to the server called test.iscx. If I just open that up in Notepad, you'll see it's just an XML file. And you have the ability here to add as many entries as you want. Some of those entries you can allow skip forward or rewind. Some of those entries you can allow to jump to the next video. Other ones, for things like advertisements, where you would want the user to view the advertisement before they get the content that they're requesting, you can say, I don't want to allow them to skip forward. I don't want to allow them to skip to the next element. So you can do all of that within this XML file. You can even do things like provide additional metadata about those videos. And so what I did in my video player, I'll just open this up in Expression Web, is I pulled in a Silverlight control. And you'll see in the file directory that I have the JS files from the Silverlight. Basically what I did here is I used Expression Encoder. Expression Encoder has this ability to output the Silverlight control that you can then embed in any web page. I just took those files, moved them into the directory, and used PHP to embed it in this page. That's what's going to appear in this large box. And then I just have spots for 5 videos across the bottom. And the way I did this was just to do it in HTML instead of writing all the output in PHP, just so that Expression Web, I could use it to render and modify the CSS. But the code itself, what it does when the request comes in, it uses the new SQL Server driver, and you can see it's very similar to all the other database drivers in PHP. Makes a connection to the database server. It makes a query just to switch my current database to MediaDB, where I'm storing the list of files, the list of content that I want to provide. It's then just executing a query in order to query out the items to put on the web page. And it's just placing those items into a list. I'm going to iterate across those items, and I'm going to call this function called createPlaylist on each item. What this createPlaylist is going to do is it's going to create that XML file. And you can see it's outputting some XML file just using the I/O routines in PHP. And it's outputting the file itself. So here's the source file from the database. But before that, what I'm going to do is output an advertisement file. For the advertisement file itself, I'm going to say you can't skip forward, you can't skip back, and you can't seek within the file. I want you to have to view this particular advertisement before you get at the content. So I'm just writing that out dynamically. Now the advertisement itself, right now what I'm doing is I'm just grabbing a random number. I've got 3 advertisements that I want to serve up, grabbing a random number and just randomly applying those. Now you could obviously get a lot more complicated here. You could look at where is the user coming from. You could do some personalization, some target marketing to direct it at advertisements that would be valuable to that particular user. But right now, this is just a simple way for us to kind of prove the concept out here. So it's a pretty simple file. Let's just go and make a request and see how this works. So we'll go to video player index.php. So it's going and randomly generating those XML files. As that's making that request, there's another way that you can do this as well. The playlist functionality has a provider model where you can provide some managed code into the playlist provider. You can also do it with a COM+ interface, so you can really use any language that you want. But what it will do is instead of requesting that file from disk, it'll call out to that provider and say, dynamically give me the list of items that you want me to serve up. So you can get a little bit fancier than generating these files and putting them on a disk. You can have, every time I request this video file, to get a new advertisement or a new playlist. So let's just see what happens. I've got a couple ads here. One is the mixed bumper that I'm using in the open space area for the videos we have there. So when I click on that, notice I cannot skip that advertisement. But the video that I requested, I can skip it, right? If I go to another one, I get another advertisement. Again, I'm randomly selecting those. I can't skip that, but then I can get to that. And we can skip forward. So this gives you an idea of the types of things that you can start to take advantage of on the Windows platform by just modifying your code a little bit or just building into some of these features and leveraging this new functionality that we've created for IIS and Windows itself. So just to quickly review what we've talked about around IIS 7, I just thought I'd pull up the pillars. And the pillars are the things that the IIS team were thinking about when they built IIS 7. And these are a lot of the things that we've talked about today. We talked about security, about having that modular architecture and being able to configure exactly the functionality that you need on the server. We talked about extensibility, the ability to now add functionality using managed code to both the pipeline as well as IIS Manager. We talked about the new XML configuration system that makes it easier for you to copy configuration files around as well as share configuration between servers. We talked about system management, the new IIS Manager that works from remote as well as locally. And we talked a little bit about diagnostics, how you can diagnose your application using that new failed request buffer as well as get runtime status of your IIS server. So I will be in the open space area immediately after this session as well as for the rest of the day. If there are other things that you want to dive deeper into or see some of the code that I showed today, please stop by and I would love to have a conversation with you. Thanks for joining me.